Hi, Manjul. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to about a very contentious, but also very critically important subject, parenting. And we're both recent fathers. You have a very young daughter, and I have two daughters myself. And disclaimer before we get into our mansplaining, we want to thank our wives for everything they do. And hopefully they don't get mad at us for anything we say today. And with that, we're gonna jump in. We'll have basically a three-part structure to the show. We'll talk about what we think generationally may have changed in parenting. We'll talk about different East versus West parenting philosophies, and then we'll jump into the very fraught nature versus nurture debate and how important parenting decisions may or may not be. So with that, we'll just go ahead and jump right in. Tell me, how has your introduction to fatherhood been going? What are some of the pros and cons?
Well, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I recently became a father about just over 6 months ago. The entry to fatherhood has taken me to a whole new level of happiness. I used to believe that happiness is a function of delta, like change. Change brings happiness, and brings so far previous in up to that point it brought short-lived happiness. That happiness would die off, whether it be from a salary increase or a promotion or anything. Within 3 months, 4 months, you're like, what next? When is my next salary increase coming? When is my next promotion coming? And stuff like that. And so that felt like a fleeting experience a little bit, and maybe that is human nature. Otherwise everyone would be content and there would be no progress. But in fatherhood, taken my happiness to a whole different level, and it's stayed there thus far, just over 6 months now. And the level doesn't need to change, and it's not about what more, it's about how to preserve what I have. This is a very new feeling in terms of I'm very happy with everything I have. How do I preserve everything? And so it's been all pros for me for the most part. Cons is in, like, it's not, all that being said, it's like not the easiest job, and it's hard, and that's what partly makes it worthwhile. And there are sacrifices to be made, whether individual, or as a couple, things you used to be able to do that you can. The friends you lose, the churn in friends definitely increases a little bit, some by choice,
Yes.
some by people's true nature too, and all that. So such has been the experience, but nothing I can point to as a pure con.
Yeah, I think I agree completely with that experience. Although, like, there's a literature out there that says, like, people's subjective experience pre and post child is a little bit lower, especially early on in those years when you're losing a lot of sleep and really dedicated to this little things, every whim. For me, I think I've heard it described as there being essentially more variance. So like the highs are higher, the lows are lower, essentially when you're a parent versus, when you're just a married, you know, what is it? Double income, no kid when you're a dink,
The
right?
dink life, yeah.
Yeah. So that's my feeling on it. But regardless of like one's, subjective psychological experience, just looking at it from, I guess, a philosophical or moral perspective, I think it's like this is the purpose of life for me is raising, the next generation, raising children. That's where you can really invest.
That is for you versus how much of that is for just we are programmed that way, humans.
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a whole debate about fathers, whether there is a paternal instinct. There's quite a bit of literature that there, of course, is a maternal instinct, right? But even then, with human beings, there's so much that goes into layering on top of our physiology, our biology of parenting that we do in the modern world. We're no longer the naked apes that came down from the trees in the African savannah, 300,000 years ago or whatnot.
Sure,
It's so
yeah.
different today. So,
Yeah, yeah. Before being a parent, and before this was even 10 years ago, when I had no intention of becoming a parent in the near term. Now, I always, ever since I met my now wife, some 10 years ago, I mean, we knew we wanted kids, but during that time, I used to question, oh, there's so many kids that are up for adoption in the world. Why do more
mhm,
people not adopt? And I
right.
said this might be a little controversial, but my then, like, now a little bit I get it, in the sense that, like, that in the innate human need of wanting to have your own child, like it requires a higher selfless act, and
Yep.
kudos to those who do adopt, and it's a very novel and thing to do and a
Mhm.
good option and should be made easier. But definitely that answer somewhat was answered to me during this process as well.
100%, I agree with that. And if you look at basically, this is a little grim, but if you look at the rates of child abuse, the people who are doing the child abuse, typically it's like a step parent or someone who's not related to the child a lot of the times. And it's a lot of that is because it takes a lot to raise a kid. And when it's not your kid and you're being asked to make those same sacrifices to provide the same level of devotion, it doesn't translate because that biological connection isn't there.
Mm.
There's some debate about that. Human nature is very flexible, but there's certainly something to the fact that blood is thicker than water. There's something to the fact of that there being that relationship, and that's it's an evolved thing essentially.
Mm.
So, moving past a little bit of that, what do you think about parenting expectations today versus the past? There's this received understanding that the expectations are so much higher today. There's even versus the recent past or even the generation before that where we have the helicopter moms or helicopter parents. I even joke about it, I call it the Apache helicopter parents. There's different phrases about this. You know what I'm
Sure.
talking about. What do
I
you think
I
about that?
Yeah, so I don't think at the core it has changed in that parents in the past wanted best for their kids to their best knowledge, and parents today want the same. Now, what is the best and how to achieve it might have changed with the world becoming increasingly more competitive, because the pool of information or level of competition certainly seems to have increased because of accessibility, which I think, again, that's a conversation for another topic, is good for the
Mm,
society as a whole, right? We encourage competition in
mm,
this country, and that's why we're prosperous. So maybe the quote unquote helicoptering and all that is to
mm,
ensure like that posterity. What does shock me that some of it is self brought on, that this celebrity SAT scandal that came out a few years
mm.
ago, school
Yep.
admissions, the fact that if one generation has already made it, that they need to still fight or feel the need, even those people need to fight for their kids' security, seems a little manufactured to me. In that, if I might butcher her name, I'm not a big into celeb names, but Lori Laughlner or whatever her name is.
Yes.
No, and don't mean it any disrespect. I just am not a person who's dialed into people's celebrity names. Certainly,
Yep.
beyond the top
Me
5 or
either.
20 names. But but the fact that, yeah, she clearly made it, people knew her from whatever in life, or based on societal definition. Again, my definition also has changed. By the way, quick digression is like, since fatherhood, my definition of what success is has changed, and I can now like secretly ridicule people who are successful in the norm worldly way but
Mhm.
unsuccessful or unhappy in my books. Seen that pretty up close, and that's where I will leave that. But just going
Yeah.
back to like, and we can get to retouch this during the East-West conversation as well.
Mhm.
All I think one wants is for their children to do better than themselves,
Yep.
and that hasn't changed. And if you're already well done, the bar is higher, and you are creating the problems for your own children if you by setting those expectations. It's all I will say. So no, to answer your
Yeah.
question, in the core, has parental expectations changed? Maybe other definitional changes have happened, but at the core, I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it is sort of an epiphenomenon, like you're saying. There's a lot of narratives that float around in public discourse about it, and I think people have different experiences of it. And I think there's a particular type of, say, upper middle class, educated, young urban professional parent that does feel that they have to dedicate essentially everything to their children. And if we look at the data, we see over time we have smaller families, we have people having children later in life, and those factors, they do raise essentially how much you're going to invest in your child. So the investment in the child is higher, I would say, versus the recent past. We go back 50, 60, 70, 80 years or so. I think we definitely see a difference because of those material factors. But at the end of the day, what we core in our heart of hearts want for our children, that hasn't changed. So,
Yeah.
and I would be the first person behind the fact that I think, regardless of how much we want to get educated and how much we want to lead successful professional lives, which I think is also important. I think it's also important to have good sized families and to have families. I think that's a good thing. I think it's good for the parents and it's definitely good for the kids because right now we still are having children a lot of the times, but a lot of times we aren't having the level of family formation that would be ideal, right? So over,
What does that mean? Elaborate. I don't understand what you mean by level of family formation and tying that to not to the number of children itself.
right. So, I mean, we do see a decline in fertility in advanced nations too, but we kind of have like a wave over the 20th century with the baby boom and then with millennials. But what I mean though is since the 60s, 70s and the birth control pill, no fault divorce and so on, we've had less and less stable families getting formed to have the child, also having children inside of marriage. So we have basically a single motherhood rate in America that's around 40% on average, which
That's
is,
crazy
much,
high to me. Like,
yeah,
yeah, that
yeah,
I
it's a
didn't know
crazy
that
high rate.
number. That shocks me. Yeah, that number definitely shocks me. I did not know that.
Yeah,
Uh,
like some level is gonna be there, right? Like that's understandable, but
how, oh,
it's so
just to be
high,
clear,
right?
are you saying 40% of mothers are single mothers, or are you saying like what is 40% exactly?
It's 40% of the births
Are
occur to
to
single
single?
mothers.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
That's just
yeah.
crazy if you think
So
about
that
it.
Yeah, it's super crazy. I don't even necessarily think that counts per se people then who are born inside of marriage, but then later on that couple splits apart. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if those are counted in that number. I think the number is
Wow. Yeah.
simply 40% of births happen to women who are not married.
Wow.
And that's a lot. It's been
Yeah. Yeah.
significantly increased over the end of the 20th century. And I do think that creates a lot of trouble. There's this recent memoir that's very moving by a guy named Rob Henderson and it's all about how he was raised in the foster system because he was born to a single mother who I think she was an illegal immigrant to the country and she became addicted to drugs. So she was not capable of caring for him. So he was taken from her and put in the foster system and she was deported, I believe. And, he was raised in the foster system and it was a very tumultuous life. And then eventually, he was able to turn his life around by going through the military and then getting into Yale and becoming a PhD in psychology, and he's been really successful ever since. But
Going
for
into
the most part,
military.
yeah, that's
There's
a
one
track
other
that
person. There's one other
yeah,
person that has come to
yeah,
prominence recently from a single mother
yes,
going into military and then to Yale.
yep, yep,
So that's
yes,
interesting that you say that.
yeah, no, yeah, and you're referring to JD Vance, and his memoir is very similar to this one in a lot of ways, and JD is acknowledged in Rob's memoir as well. He definitely was a factor in Rob writing the memoir as well, I believe.
Oh,
So yeah, there's a lot of stories like that we end up hearing, but those are extremely rare stories, right? So for the most part, the fact that
definitely.
we don't have family structures forming in the ways that they have traditionally, there are definitely some negative consequences to that for children. And it'd be nice to find a way out of it. I don't have a solution,
Yeah,
but yeah, it's something that's different than in
yeah.
the recent past. But let's move on to different parenting philosophies because I think I'm going to learn a lot from you on this because you grew up in a totally different place than me. So we're going to, I guess, dig into what are the differences between Eastern versus Western styles of parenting. So you've seen a little bit of both. I'm totally naive, totally ignorant of, what does parenting look like in the East essentially. So what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so my wife's wife grew up in the US. I grew up in Nepal. And we've talked about this also, like over times, about like what were the differences. And I think it boils down to a few key things, and not in any kind of particular order, but starting with independence. Western parents may encourage their children to be more independent, be more individualistic, whereas Eastern parents are focused more, maybe so, on routine, discipline, society, and teaching children what they should and shouldn't do, almost in a templatized way. And just before I go deeper, by the way, if we look at certain data, both philosophies, we could argue one is better than the other, both ways. So I will quote one stat that I found particularly interesting, right? Like, and when we talk East, from my perspective, I'm talking my upbringing in Nepal, but it's very similar, I would assume, from what I understand here, because I speak Hindi as well, so I a little bit am familiar with cultures in India. So despite having a very small share of the U.S. population compared to African Americans, Hispanics, the most represented non-white U.S. CEOs in the U.S. were Asian Indians. In fact, they comprise 49% of CEO positions, or 40 plus percent, let's call it, in S&P 500 in 2023. That's a crazy
Mm.
stat, right? And
Yep.
some of them like had no degree even in the US at all, completely degrees from India. And that I tie that to parental philosophies, focus on education, the discipline that is needed. A little bit I tie it to the gain to pain ratios, in terms of like inhibiting in children that you have more to gain with the same level of pain, in terms of like inhibiting that philosophy of working hard and everything. Not to say that doesn't happen in the West. Now, again,
Mm.
over time, having been in the States over a decade now, I, again, given we are like in a well provided situation for my daughter, in the sense that for me, I'm maximizing her happiness than success. Sometimes I even joke saying, oh, we love her so much, it's almost better for us if she's quote unquote unsuccessful in worldly terms, so we have her forever in our basement. And
You may change
this,
your tune on that later.
definitely will. That's why it's a joke. It's just the expression of how much we
Yeah.
already fear about the day when we'll have to drive her to college, or whatever that might be.
Mm.
So, like, my focus
Yep.
is purely on her happiness, individualism, and letting that foster and grow. Nothing else. I have no aspirations of whether she want like to turn her into a engineer, doctor, or a professional tennis athlete, anything of such. So being able to do the right thing, to choose whatever that means, and that's evolving as I learn more things, is the way I'm going. So I'm in a way agreeing to raise my daughter in a slightly different way than maybe I've
Mm.
been raised, despite, on the worldly sense, a guy from Nepal coming to the US and all the things, quote on, again, like I keep saying quote unquote, in the sense that these the definition of accomplishment has truly changed for me in the last 6 months. Until 6 months, I would consider, like, and I still do because of other things, but like the world would consider me pretty accomplished, I would think. But for me, none of that now matters. I will consider myself accomplished if after 18 years you check up on me and I've raised healthy, happy children that are like happy more so than anything and are good people. Educated,
So,
sure, up to high school. Beyond that, again, it's their choice and all. So I digress, but
wow, wow, that's lenient.
it is lenient. Trust me, I am
Yeah.
lenient on that, and we can that is also for another episode. But since you bring that up, I had lately I've been having this conversation with some of my um, coworkers as well. The cost of education is increasing.
Mm.
Treasuries are giving 5-6%. You can invest in corporate bonds at 7%.
Mm.
If you were to educate your child in normal sense, in the normal distribution, an average American, and I know
Mm.
maybe there's some diversion based on private public education, can expect to spend almost like $500,000 plus on their
Mm.
child's education up to college. And
Yeah, I
even
mean,
then they might need an MBA from a fancy degree, which could drive the cost up. If you
yeah,
added that money and invested that for them, and they were to
right.
only take that off when they are 25, the compounded annual returns of that would give them a cash flow outstream of somewhere around the tune of, these are rough numbers, rough assumptions, but they could harvest potentially up to $150,000 every year without working. And I'm not even advocating that they shouldn't work and be couch potatoes, by the way. There's technical
Right.
schools, there's ways to
Mm.
do the same thing for cheap. um,
Right.
and they might be better off in their life that way. They have 150 that is coming perpetually, by the way. You have created essentially an endowment, a perpetual thing for them that they can
Mm.
reap the benefits of. And
Mm.
now, like, we can debate whether that themselves will then be a causality in making them less motivated. I don't know, but they don't need
Mm.
to know about this.
Right. You can
So
find out when
it's a,
they're adults.
it's a thought. Yeah, it's a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's something we should definitely dig in on a later episode because the cost of college is a hugely important thing. I have some thoughts
And
on that, but
yeah, and in an AI
uh,
driven world, the value of it too. So yeah, definitely note for another episode. We can edit
yeah,
this out, but
no, I like it. It's something that is important to touch on, but I want to circle back to essentially your Eastern Western parenting conversation and ask whether do you think you were subjected to, quote, a tiger parenting? Are you familiar with that term, like the tiger
uh,
mom?
I have heard
That's
of it,
the
but I wouldn't mind the explanation. So why don't you provide the explanation?
Yes, yeah. So I don't know if the phrase originates with Amy Chua, who is a Yale law professor, but her memoir about the parenting of her two daughters is called Tiger Mom. And it's like a stereotype of a type of Eastern parenting, especially like East Asian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and so on, about basically a very authoritarian style of parenting where, they're forced to practice piano hours and hours on end. They can never go out with friends. They always need to be studying, 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 and so on like that. And I was just wondering, to what some of the things you said, mentioned maybe not that extreme, but that you were subjected to some of these more disciplinarian or more authoritative sort of styles of parenting versus, the contrasting Western style, which is maybe a little looser, though it's
Uh,
been increasingly more interventional now, I would say, still to this day, even though it's soft, it's a soft version of it.
no, first, yeah, just to clarify, definitely no tiger parenting for me in that sense. So now both my parents are educated, and they had to go leaps and bounds to be educated, in fact. So they came from poor backgrounds, and had to, in a way, especially for my mom, who's eighth of eight children, had to actually fight to be educated because society then, in
Mm.
the village that she grew up, did not necessarily see value in educating women, and so she had to actually struggle to get educated. And a little bit different on my dad's side, but that being said, yeah, my parents are definitely exceptions for their generations, so they definitely valued education. That's for sure. I can tell you one anecdote, in terms of value focus on education, is where I grew up. In school, they would post the ranking of every child publicly to be seen. So there were up to four exams a year, and then the cumulative grade and ranking, each child would be ranked. So you almost had a rank associated with you.
Mm.
Maybe it's genetic, maybe upbringing, but yeah, I was like always in top five, here and there,
Mm.
maybe outside top five, but never below top 10 out of
Mm.
um, student body of, or like class size of maybe 200 or slightly less, let's call it. um,
Mm.
so even though I was top five student, generally in the top three, I was never top one until 10th grade. But so
Mm.
my dad had this reward system, almost in a way tiered system. Depending on my rank, he would take me to the quality of sweet shop after we went to collect the results. You go to collect the result on a weekend, and depending on how
Yeah.
well I did, I could go to that caliber of restaurant or sweet shop equivalent to ice cream, versus you could go to Ben and Jerry's versus Jenny's, or Craters, depending on your grade. And like, I'm like,
Yes.
Dad, do you see how many people I beat? And he's like, don't look down, look up in life, see how many people
Right.
beat you. And so, like, in a way, they almost never, that made me feel that, oh, you're done, you're doing great. In a way, it was like always room for improvement kind of mentality. You're good, but
Yep.
there's room for greatness, or room for betterment, improvement kind of thing. And one other thing I will say is societal pressure a little bit. It's always compared. If there's a neighborhood kid that is in the same grade at a different school, or so in the 10th grade, everyone in the whole country takes the same exam. Okay, it's called SLC, School Leaving Certificate. A little bit, it's the British reminiscence, which like British were never in Nepal. It's never
Mm.
colonized, but as you know, India was colonized, and then Nepal has a lot of influence from India.
Yep.
So we study a little bit in the British education system, I think, reminiscent of that. So everyone takes the same exam, so you could compare apples to apples in a way with your neighbors, a neighbor's kid, your relatives who is far away, even living in a different province or different district. And that became a subject of pride for not necessarily to my parents, but like to society, and if essentially they couldn't necessarily avoid that thing. That
Mhm.
exam, I did come out valedictorian of my school, which was the only time until then I had become valedictorian. Until ninth and all, there were always these two smart
Yes.
women who would always outsmart me, let's call it. And so that one little bit I lucked out on the 10th grade. And
Mhm.
so those kind of pressures were there in terms of needing to education being the way. And when I say way out, it like people have a different perceivement of when they think like of other countries that are labeled third world countries. Again, like I'm an economist at heart, and I like to
Mhm.
call different name developing countries. But either
Mhm.
way, the perceivement. But for you, when you were born at a place, that's your world, right? Like
Right.
that is your world, that's what you care about, and people are living there. People, if you truly measure in happiness, people, some of the people in those countries might be happier than quote again like other places. So that's what mattered then. When I say education was felt like a way enriching or taking your level up, right? Sports was not the case in Nepal, smaller size. um, it'll be very interesting to look at, because if you look at just a quick adage, like if you look at top paid athletes in the world, like some very prominent Indians will feature there. But because India is a big country, obviously, I wonder what percentage of kids, quote again, waste their life. And we have talked about this
Mhm.
a little bit maybe with you,
Yeah.
and maybe subject for another topic too. The fact, the emphasis on
Yes.
sports in children's life in the US is questionable
Mhm.
to me. Yes, sports has more
Yep.
things than that, but the level of devotion parents give to children's
Mhm.
sport, when they know that most likely your kid is not going to be an NBA or NFL star, right? The
Mhm.
likelihood of that happening is rare. If we are
Yep.
purely looking at data and you're playing the percentages game, you shouldn't be spending weekends after weekends on their sport, whether they're a master golfer and paying for that. That's a whole other level of expenses that people bear as well.
Yep.
If you can do it and you have nothing better to do with your time, go
Mhm.
for it. But I don't know if it's a disillusionment or what it is. From my perspective, the level of investment in sports, in fact, there are some universities in this country where sports is more important than academics. That completely baffles me. Not to raise any controversies here, I do live in
One might be pretty
Columbus.
close to you.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Yeah.
I do live in Columbus. So yeah, so
Yeah.
I tie this up because there was a realism, and I think that's the case explaining this tiger thing. So hopefully that was not as much of a digression. That like,
Mhm.
look, if you 80-90%, and I'm throwing numbers out, of people make a living through day-to-day professional work, which is achieved through education in that field. And
Yep.
so those parents and the East maybe realizes education is a better investment of time and money than
Mhm.
sports, or like, so like, yeah, definitely no piano lesson emphasis in Nepal, I can tell you that, right?
Right. Right.
Definitely not. So yes, the highest education or weighting was definitely put on studying and out achieving your peers. But that being said,
Mhm.
I was into sports. I like to
Mhm.
think if I had I like to think if I the same genes, same everything, I was born in the US, I would have
Mhm.
played Division 1 sports of my choosing. Beyond that, I don't want to overclaim. So I did have that athletic ability or inclination, but that wasn't fostered in that environment. And now
Right.
looking back, thankfully so, rightfully so.
Yeah, there's a really good section of a recent book I read called Family Unfriendly by Tim Carney that actually does take a look at the sports culture in America and how much like the club sports and the you know different sports things that people do on weekends that he says are not only are they not necessarily good uses of time, you're not necessarily going to see a payoff down the road, but they also essentially take away too from how many children people decide to have because they're like, we're going to make all this investment in Johnny. We can't have another Johnny. There's these silly things that we've done. Some of it's totally unnecessary. On the flip side, it's good. People definitely need to get physical exercise, physical experiences, and
Yeah.
increasingly people are just staring at screens all the time and they're not getting
Yeah.
enough exercise too. So,
Yeah, if those are
but
the choices, definitely advocate sports. Just like
yeah,
questioning about this travel sports where middle
yeah,
schoolers are
travel.
traveling across straight borders and
Yep,
like
yep,
playing softball, baseball all day long. Like when
yep,
you can do that in your neighborhood and cut off 4 or 5 hours of travel.
yep.
Yes, definitely there's side advantage. I play sports. Like I love sports is my third love or second love besides family. Like
Mm,
I played but because it makes me happy, I do it right outside the park at the closest park to my home rather, and all that.
yep.
And it helps you keep fit, and maybe it gives you personality, teamwork, teaches something. Just quickly disclaimer: we're not bashing all sports.
No, I
And
know.
in
I
fact,
love
I
sports.
I love, yeah, you played sports. I enjoy
Yeah.
sports betting. There's value to it. I'm talking about the culture of, yeah, we are talking about that culture versus
Yes.
again, the opportunity cost of what your kid could learn with that time, maybe a
Yeah.
language or maybe something else.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. All right, cool. So we've wrapped up Western, Eastern, although I guess I'll weigh in. I think I kind of went through a pretty traditional sort of pretty involved parenting experience. There's a lot of emphasis on both. Essentially, I went through the travel sports system as well as the very high emphasis on education. Now, it was pretty normal. It wasn't like crazy intense or anything, but it was pretty well structured. A lot of my summers, I was doing something formal. Some type of science camp or some type of sports camp. A lot of my time was structured. I didn't have what's now advocated like a free range childhood or like I didn't live a latchkey life. So it was a little bit more protected, a little bit more in a bubble. But even despite that, and also because of it, I think it worked out for me. So I don't think it's totally terrible to have that level of high involvement parenting. It works out in some cases, and in other cases, it doesn't. Sometimes it creates burnout and a lot of friction between parents and children. So it's a little bit dependent on the child. So
It's knowing how
regardless,
when to let go, because if you cage a bird, you're protecting it, but you're not letting it fly.
yeah. Exactly. And it may or may not matter at the end of the day how one parents will jump into the whole nature versus nurture discussion now. I'm not sure. In our prep notes, I had mentioned that I'd read a book on a field called behavioral genetics, right? In the behavioral genetics field, it does these studies called twin studies. And they basically compare identical twins to non-identical twins, and they see how much more similar the identical twins are to the non-identical twins. And based on those comparisons, they can get an idea, assuming all the assumptions hold in the experiment, on how similar the identical twins are because of genes or because of environment. So it allows them to capture that genetic part or capture the environment part. It's a little bit of a simplification, but these studies generally find that this is another big simplification, but that most traits are come down to like 50, like when we're talking like most psychological traits, come down to like 50% heritable, 50% due to variation in genes versus like some physical traits which are like more like 70, 80% versus the environment. Now, there's some variation around that 50%, but it's around 50%. And that may seem like, oh, it's 50-50 environment genes. But when you're talking about effect sizes in psychology, having a 50% effect size is actually enormous. And so there's quite a significant effect due to maybe what's being captured as genes in these twin studies. And so there are some people who go so far to say that parents are important. Like if you didn't have any parents at all, things wouldn't go well. But when you're in a situation where people are having parents and they're going through kind of normalish childhoods, that parenting isn't really changing the child's outcome. The child outcome is going to be what it was going to be because the real input that's causing The variation in outcome is the genes. And that can be really controversial because people are like, oh, you're saying my parenting doesn't matter. But that's not really what's being said. It's just that, when we hold a variable kind of steady, which like all these little parenting decisions that we make, did you hold her correctly? Did you, sleep train her? Did you send her to daycare? Things like this, they
Mhm.
kind of wash out in the end. And the real variance is due to genes. I was curious what you think of that narrative.
So let me first ask a clarification. Are you saying a part of your life is in a way destined? You come with the genetic, in a science way, you could say genetic code is written, and you'll be within this variable range. You'll have a range of outcomes, but that range is kind of determined. Someone who like might be a little more believing in higher power could say fate and destiny. Is that a fair accurate? Like maybe it's not, but like, can you elaborate on that?
So without getting technical in the field, like we always avoid phraseology around things being determined. It's just that there is a probability that you can predict something with high confidence based on just looking at what we have in the genes alone. Now,
It's a
whether
cop
that
out
reality is true or
conclusion
not,
in
it's still debated. Sure, I
no, I'm
know, but
joking, but
but I understand. But like law of large numbers, like if you lived your life 100 times, or 100 similar people lived the
that
life,
I
or a
understand. Yeah.
hundred, then the outcome is going to fall into the same slot, however many percentage of the time.
Yeah.
And we have a good idea of what's going to happen, one, by looking at your genes or just by looking at your parents. And the counter is to like, people are going to say, oh, well, the parents are either wealthy or not wealthy, or the parents are good parents or not good parents. They're going to say there are these like things that kind of confound this conclusion,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there's a lot of effort that's been going in to figure this out. And the more and more this question gets looked at is that not only are nature and nurture hard to separate, we know that nature is important, but nature and nurture are kind of commingled together. So like the genes that your parents have matter, not just your genes. And so the genes that they have, the ones that they passed to you, but also the ones that they didn't pass to you, are also important for how your life goes as well, because those genes that they have influence some of their behaviors and how they treat you. So it's an input on the parenting itself, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So there's really no escape from biology, even though there's also no escape from the environment. They both matter, but it's just that how much control do we have is the real question.
Yeah.
And some of this science makes us skeptical about whether we have as much control as we think we have.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely biology, and then there's psychology in the sense that
Mhm.
anything is possible. You can rise from the bottom or rise from wherever.
Mhm.
Um, so people like to think, of course, and maybe that's a good thing, that they can control their destiny.
Mhm.
But what you're saying is a good relief. Parents should interpret it as a good thing that, oh, yeah, that
Mhm.
one time I accidentally made a slight bump on the bathtub. Probably,
Yes, yes,
probably is
exactly.
okay, and don't lose sleep and make other poor decisions because of one. So
Yeah.
there's ways in which study is what it is. Who am I to question science? In
Mhm.
fact, I don't. And so it's good. Like,
Yeah.
that like some of it is, in a way, I don't want to put words in your mouth,
Mhm.
pre-written, but you have the power to override it with, whether it be hard work, but even in day-to-day life there's a lot of luck.
Mhm.
Certainly, I looking back, and like this goes to Fooled by Randomness and everything, books like that,
Mhm.
where
Yep.
we attribute success to hard work and failure to bad luck.
Mhm.
Whereas, like, as you grow, as you read these books, you realize, okay, no, yeah, I did all the right things. There's a catchy phrase, I like quotes, as you know, that not
Mhm.
it's not coming, but success is when hard work meets luck at the same time, something like that. So you
Yep.
have to be there and have done the right thing, and it is what it is. And the way the world is evolving and everything, like, regardless, if you do somewhat of a range of right things, you should find way to be happy, nonetheless. Yeah, I mean, doesn't seem like there's a template in which you can produce a president or vice president. Certainly not.
Yeah. Yeah. This sort of science, this behavioral genetic science, sociobiology science, there's different terms that get used for the type of science here that's going on, which actually involves a lot of economic professors, by the way. So maybe we'll talk about that later. But
Mm.
it does, I think it should be interpreted positively, like you're saying, that, we can't necessarily control everything in our lives. And, that's okay.
Yeah,
Some of like who we are is just who we are. But
yeah,
what we can recognize about that is learning who we are, learning what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, and minimizing those weaknesses and doubling down on the strengths. And I think this is a heuristic that you agree with as well. But if you do the Shakespeare know thyself, then your life should be okay because you'll be
yeah,
able to optimize what you're good at, minimize what
yeah,
you're bad at,
yeah,
and find
yeah.
your niche. Find your niche.
Yeah.
And
On that front, I like this saying that if your child is good in tennis or really any sport, but bad at math, get them a tennis coach and not a math tutor. Now, this is taken to the extreme to make a
yes,
point, but you should
yeah,
really hone, and that's Econ 101, comparative
mm,
advantage, along the lines of that. Find out what you're good at and be top 10, top 20%, 30% even of that field, and you'll do well in
mm,
life and
yep,
still be a jack of all trades after that,
yep.
jack of all trades, master of none, still better than one.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things in America that I do worry about versus in Eastern societies, which have these really kind of brutal sort of like meritocratic mechanisms where they're doing these testing, testing, testing. And it's not that, a lot of the times it's overly indexed on specifically specific types of educational or intellectual skills, but like really understanding where you as an individual lie in the distribution, different sorts of dimensions of possible economically or socially valuable activities. And
Oh
I
yeah,
feel like we don't necessarily figure that out as children or young adults, and we should be have better mechanisms for figuring that out, and also just a broader understanding too of what's socially valuable, because even in the West a lot of the times we're still overly invested in getting to the Ivy League or getting that fancy consulting job at the Big Four or getting into medical school or getting into law school or any of these sorts of traditional markers of success. And there are potentially many other ways in which somebody can be a valuable, contributing, worthwhile member of society that is outside of those things. If we
yeah,
only value these sorts of things, we only have selecting mechanisms for those, we're potentially missing out on a lot of human capital that's out there, and
totally.
just wonder what ways we can figure out to find those sorts of things. I don't think we've,
Yeah,
as a polity, thought closely enough about that. But
yeah, and it's funny. One thing I noticed, the emphasis on fitting in education in the U.S. Right?
hmm,
Every college is marketing, oh, you will fit right in. This is the right fit. This and that. It's about fitting in, fitting in. But if you step back and be like, well, when I step out of college and this education system and go into the professional world or real world, as some put it, I don't necessarily get overcompensated for fitting in. I have to stand out. You have to stand out at every front
yep,
of your professional life to get that promotion, because professional corporations or professional jobs are a pyramid at the end of the day. So fitting in,
yep,
the most fit in is the bottom, and then you have to stand out, stand out, stand out. So like the education system focuses fitting in, whereas the job system rewards standing out. Is another like kind of parallel I draw there too. So honing in individuality, and like, yeah, like of course you want to have like friends, learn from them. In our fraternity we used to say, whatever your strengths, the fraternity claims it, and whatever your weaknesses, with the help of others, will help like get rid of it or minimize it, something along those lines. So that value, one value, does seem to have some truth to that.
well, awesome. All right, so we've exhausted our time. Let's to finish out. Give me one piece of parenting advice that you think is critical to know.
Do your best, let God/nature take care of the rest.
Nice. I've convinced you of the on the nature nurture point.
Yeah.
So for me, I guess maybe my advice is a little more granular. My eldest daughter, she's extremely energy and is kind of like in her own world, so sometimes it can be hard to reach her. One of the things that like we try to get her to listen. There's some discipline that she needs to be taught. And so one of the things I found works is just being really consistent. And one of my strategies that I use is just simply the 1, 2, 3. There's and it seems like silly and so on, but it really works. Like if you say like I'm gonna count to 3, and if I get to 3 and you haven't listened or done whatever it is that you are supposed to do, there will be a consequence. And this basic reinforcement learning is quite effective. So it
That
harkens back to some basic psychology, but it's very effective.
That's interesting though, because Emily Oster would say you better follow through your consequence,
Yes,
or if not,
that's
you're
right.
making empty threats, and that you have to up the ante every single time, and you don't want to be playing poker with a erratic child. Um,
Yes,
so
yes,
yeah, I'm glad we didn't conclude a whole episode on parenting without mentioning Emily Oster and her work here. For people who are more interested,
yes,
definitely her blog is out there. Emily Oster, a couple of her books. While I don't agree with everything she has to say, definitely,
of
again,
course.
part of reading and education is about finding what questions to ask rather than finding answers
Yes,
itself, not necessarily agreeing with whatever experts say because they themselves are figuring it out. Again, we've talked
yes,
in previous episode about incentives and all that for academics writing books. But
yep.
definitely her work here is commendable and people should go check it out.
Yes, totally. It's a great recommendation. She has so much to say using data. She's basically like the Moneyball meets mommy blogging. And yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks again for joining me, Manjul. See
Thank
you
you.
later.